going on, guys? I want to share with you guys a few tricks that I use when I'm doing rod bearings on any car, not only the S54 but every car. So I'll get the bearing cap and I'll get the bearing and I'll get closer to you guys and I'll show you what I do when I'm installing the bearings. I'm gonna use the cap because, as you all know, the rod's still in the car and it's really uncomfortable for me to get down there with the phone, set up the phone. You guys not going to be able to see much, so I'm just going to show you. And I have a rod from a B58 that's out, which I'm going to be showing you guys as well. What I do with that rod, I'm going to be showing you guys as well with the rod out of the car, how the tricks that I use work and why I use them. All right, so number one tip that I want to give you guys: have your hands clean. Don't use gloves. Do not use gloves doing this job. Have your hands clean, free of oil. Try to wipe them so you have touch on your fingers. When you're touching the rod bearings, when you're touching the rods, when you're touching the bolts, you want to make sure there's no debris in between. And I'm gonna explain you why you don't want any debris in between. Okay, so when you installing the rod bearings, right, you want to clean this area on the bearing cap and behind the bearing. You want to have this clean. You want to make sure it's all cleaned up. And if you're using a coated bearing, sometimes the coating gets behind the bearing, so you want to use Scotch-Brite pad and you want to clean that coating from the back of the bearing. But you have to be very careful and not touch the face of the bearing. So you only want to touch the back of the bearing, clean it very good, and not clean the face of the bearing. So please don't use any brake cleaner on the bearing, especially if it's coated. So just clean the back of it, clean where it's gonna sit. And now, one tip that I want to talk about: what holds the bearings in place, it's not the keys that you see here. It's not those keys. Those keys do not hold the bearing in place. This is just so you put the bearings in the right direction, because they are directional. So you don't want them to be, instead of this way, facing that way, because the engine spins in one rotation. So you want to make sure the bearing is in the right rotation. That's the reason why they have keys, not to lock them in place, because some bearing in some cars, they don't have those keys. It's just the bearing, okay? And what holds them in place is the clamping force once you torque them. Okay, once you torque them in place, that's what's gonna hold them together. Okay, it's gonna press. So pretty much once you have the rod in here, you pretty much, let me just put it in here. Okay, so once you torque the rod, it's gonna press against each other, against the walls, and that's what's gonna hold it in place. So that being said, before you install your rod bearings, you want to lube the back of, and I'll tell you why. Because once you have that bearing in place, okay, once you have that bearing in place, like so, when you go to put it in the rod, when you go to put it in the car, sometimes it's not, like you can see here, this side is lower, right, than that side. So once you put it in the rod, what's gonna happen is the rod bearing that's in place, it's gonna push this one that way to its home, right, until it sits flush like this. So you want to have a little bit of lube in between, in the back of the bearing, so it slides into its home easily and it doesn't bind, it doesn't scratch the back of it. And you want to also make sure it's very clean before you put the lube behind the bearing, because any little debris, and that's why I tell you not to use gloves, because you have feelings on your hand and you're gonna feel if there's any debris. Clean it off. You don't want anything in the back of the bearing, because that could, and damaging the shape of the bearing, it's gonna mess up with the clearance between the rod bearing and the crankshaft. And remember, there's no contact with the bearing and the crankshaft. There's an oil film in between the two. So you want that clearance to be perfect and nothing in between, meaning nothing in between here and behind the bearing, because behind the bearing is going to throw the clearance off when you torque and the bearing is going to be out of shape. So you don't want that to happen. You want it to be clean as possible. So that's my tip for you guys. And I'm going to get the rod and I'm going to torque the rod on the bench, just so you guys can see what happens when you have the lube behind the bearing. Okay, so as you guys can see here, I purposely have the rod bearing out of place. As you can see, it's sitting up more than it should. And I just used oil that I had sitting in a pan here. This is a old B58 parts that were just sitting in a pan here, and I'm using as demonstration to you guys and why I recommend putting oil behind the bearing. So let's put the cap here. So this is just, I'm just gonna torque it by hand just so you guys can see what's gonna happen. Now, as you can see, it pushed the bearing into place and all the oil just came out of behind the bearing. So it doesn't stay there, it comes out mostly torqued. But the main reason why you want to do that is to push that bearing into its home. You want it to sit properly. So that's it for today. This is the tips I have for you guys. It's very simple, very minor, but is things that you want to do when you're installing your bearings to just avoid any failure. So you want to avoid failure, and this is how you would avoid any failure, any premature wear to your components. All right, thank you guys for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one.